Oof, last night was interesting. I was a lot colder than I thought I'd be. As I take the tent down, there's one other thing about the X-Dome that I think could use improvement. So in the end, these bags might be a winter camping game changer. Even though I've been winter camping a ton in temperatures down to -50, in tons of snow and remote locations, my gear still isn't dialed in. And this trip is all about testing some new gear items to see if it solves a variety of problems that I have with my current setup. Problems like sleeping warm and comfortable, having a pack that is too heavy and bulky, and having boots that freeze on me overnight. I'm hoping these blue bags are the solution to my frozen boot problem. Basically, my feet sweat a lot, even in the wintertime, and I need some sort of waterproof barrier to prevent that sweat from getting into the insulation of my boots. I've tried turkey roasting bags, bread bags, but the problem is that none of them are super durable and they end up ripping over the course of a trip. Basically, the way they work is that I put my sock on, slide these on over top, and then just slide the whole contraption into my boot. As with all the gear that I'm testing on this trip, I'll check in with you guys as the trip goes along to let you know how the gear is performing. The other gear that I'm testing on the trip are the X-Dome tent, a sleeping pad that's new to me. I'm gonna be pushing the limits of a top insulation system, testing a new pot, as well as continuing to test these sexy mesh base layers. The problem that I'm looking to address with the mesh base layers is temperature regulation. I really want to be able to stay warm in winter conditions like I'm out in right now, but I also don't want to get too warm and end up sweating, because sweating is a surefire way to get really cold in the long run. The benefit of a mesh base layer system, and I'm using it both on my torso as well as my legs, is that the gaps in the mesh trap warm air and are very effective at keeping you warm. But then if you start getting too warm, it's really easy to dump heat by opening up vents on your jacket and your pants, introducing some airflow into the mesh and disrupting those warm air pockets. But what I really want to test on this trip is the stink factor. The mesh base layers I'm using are made of polypropylene, and in my experience, polypropylene gets really stinky during extended use. And in the winter, I don't take off my base layers. I'm gonna be wearing these all the way up to camp while I'm sleeping and then back to the car, and it's gonna be a good test on whether they get stinky or not. I've come to the spot where I'm gonna set up camp. I've already stomped out my tent pad. I was gonna hike up to that ridge in order to get some nicer views and stuff like that, but the views here are pretty spectacular and I was feeling kind of lazy. So the mesh base layers have been working really well. Normally on a trip like that with so much elevation gain, I'd be pretty darn sweaty, but with the mesh base layers and able to open up all these vents, I dumped a lot of heat and I didn't get nearly as sweaty as I normally would. The problem that I'm trying to solve with the X-Dome tent has to do with freestanding tents. I've been a big fan of freestanding tents in wintertime recently because they're a lot easier to set up on sugary snow, or if you're out in conditions where there's not enough snow for deadman anchors or on really rocky ground. But the issue with a lot of winter-specific freestanding tents is that they're very heavy and very bulky. And that's where the X-Dome comes into play. It's a very lightweight tent at under a kilogram, yet I think it has all the tools to deal with winter conditions, but I need to test that out. There's really two things that I want to test out with the X-Dome on this trip. The first one is, how well is it gonna handle snow load? And I'm not gonna get a ton of snow tonight, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set up the tent and throw my 35-pound pack on top of it and see how it does. The other thing that I wanna see is how the tent does in the wind. I've had it out in 65-kilometer-an-hour winds, and I know it can handle that, but I'm not sure how it's gonna do from a warmth perspective. There's a lot of mesh on this tent, and as wind is coming up onto the ridge, it's gonna be getting in under the tent potentially, getting through that mesh and cooling me off. I have used the X-Dome on several trips already, and it's one of my favorite tents that I've ever used, basically of all time. But there are a few things that I think could be improved upon. The first are the feet that the poles go into at each corner. They're just a little bit hard to get the poles into. And because Dan wants it so you can set it up either inner first or as all-in-one, there's two different slots that you need to put the pole into. And especially in the wintertime when you're wearing gloves, it can just be really difficult to do. In order to help with that, and because I'm mostly just gonna be setting it up as an all-in-one pitch, I took the cordage for the inner loops and tied them on to the outer loops in order to just make it so it's a little bit easier. I'm not having to reach under the tent and try and find those inner little feet. The other thing that I wanna see is a guy out point right here. So we have a guy out loop up here. You can wrap it around the pole, and it's really effective at providing a lot of support at this position. But like I said, I tested this tent out and it survived 65-kilometer-an-hour winds. If it survived above that, you're gonna have to wait and see until that video drops in order to find out. But with a guy out point here combined with the fact that you can add trekking poles on the broadsides, I think the X-Dome could potentially handle over 100km/h winds. The third item I'm testing out on this trip is the Xped 7R sleeping pad. I did a comparison video of the Tensor Extreme Conditions and the Thermarest X-Therm sleeping pad, both awesome winter sleeping pads, but a lot of you wanted to know, how does the Xped 7R stack up? And I'm gonna test it on this trip because the problem with the other two pads is they're not comfortable. And the vertical baffles on the Xped 7R I think are going to be quite a bit more comfortable for me. I've tested out the 5R and the 3R and they're both comfortable. The question with the 7R is it going to be warm enough? I've used Xped winter rated sleeping pads before and I was cold on them. Xped did a redesign with the Ultra 7R and I'm on cold ground, I'm on snow, and tonight's going to be a really good test to see whether I'm warm and comfortable. The best place to find new gear like the mesh base layers and the Ultra 7R pad is the sponsor of today's video, Garage Grown Gear. Especially if you're looking to drop weight from your pack in order to make trips easier and less hard on your body, Garage Grown Gear is the best place to find ultralight gear. If you head to the Garage Grown Gear new gear page, you'll likely find something that you've never seen or heard of before and aims to solve a problem or a challenge in the backpacking world. I definitely recommend checking out Garage Grown Gear and their new gear page down at the link in the video description. The sun's dropping behind the mountains, so it's getting cold really quick. So I'm gonna change into some warmer layers. I'm putting on my big down jacket, and then we'll go over the other 3 pieces of gear that I'm gonna be testing on this trip. The other aspect of my sleep system that I'm testing out on this trip is my top insulation. Normally in the wintertime, I'm using sleeping bags, but there's a couple problems that I have with sleeping bags. First of all, they're very heavy and bulky. And then the second problem has to do with the fact that when you're laying on your back on them, you're compressing all of that down insulation. And then as soon as you roll to your side, that compressed down insulation is exposed to the cold air around you. So when temperatures are down in -30, -40, I'm finding that I have to lay on my back basically the entire time, and it's not super comfortable. So what I'm gonna try and do this winter is use quilts more often. So right now I have a down quilt underneath here that's rated to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I have a synthetic top quilt rated to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The benefit of a quilt system is that you're not compressing any insulation and you can shift positions underneath them without ever kind of getting cold spots exposed to the cold air around you. The challenge with quilts, and this is what I'm gonna really try and test on this trip, is whether you can get a good seal between the quilts and the sleeping pad in order to avoid drafts, and whether you can keep your head warm by using some sort of hood system. On this trip, I'm gonna be using a toque as well as a synthetic hood made by Enlighten Equipment, and I should be pretty warm with that. Tonight, the forecast is supposed to get down to below -20 degrees Celsius, so quite cold. And if I find that I'm toasty warm in this system, then that's gonna be a good indication that I can push the limits of it, take it to that next step, head out in -30, and see whether I can get a quilt system to work in those temperatures. I just realized with talking about the vapor barriers right at the beginning of the trip, we're on to the 6th and final item that I'm gonna be testing, and that's a new pot. This is a 650 milliliter pot, so smaller than the usual 2-liter pot that I bring on winter camping trips. The problem that I have with 2-liter pots is that they're gigantic. They're super bulky. They're not that much heavier, but that bulk really starts to add up when you're dealing with winter gear. The benefit of a 2-liter pot is that I can melt a lot of snow in it very quickly. But I'm curious to see if the 1650 milliliter pot is kind of a sweet spot in order to not be super bulky, but still melt enough snow that I'm never really feeling like I'm running out of water and then kind of dealing with dehydration. I really like this pot as well because it has this handle on it. With my 2-liter pot, there's a bail handle, but I find that sometimes it's a little bit unwieldy, especially when I'm wearing big gloves. With all the other gear, I'm gonna wait till tomorrow in order to give you an update on how it's doing. We'll see how the vapor barrier is holding up, whether the mesh layer starts to stink, whether I was warm in my sleep system, and then how the X-Dome does with the wind that's still kind of blowing in off of the mountains. But with this pot, we're gonna get results today. And I'm gonna start melting snow right now, and we're gonna see if I miss that extra 350 milliliters of capacity. So right now, I'm melting snow for dinner. I have one of my homemade freeze-dried meals again. Excited to try that out. Well, I'm focusing on 6 kind of items that I'm testing on this trip. If you're interested in any of the other gear that I'm using on this trip, like this koozie, my snowsuit, anything like that, I'll have a link to my full Pack Wizard gear list down in the video description so you guys can check that out. So we almost have a boil here, and I've been thinking about it, and I think this size of pot is actually gonna be perfect. I'll have enough water in order to get my meal made, and then a liter left in order to add into my Nalgene here. All right, we got a boil. Woohoo! get this into my freeze-dried meal. I do wish this had a spout, like a little triangular bit on the corner in order to help pour. That's probably way more water than I needed. Crap, this is gonna be a soupy meal. I didn't really think that through. Yeah, it is what it is. So yeah, overall, I think this pot is gonna work out in the wintertime, especially on overnight trips like this where I'm by myself. I think I'd rather bring this than the giant 2-liter pot. I'm gonna enjoy the sunset, enjoy my meal, and then crawl into bed and get a really, really long sleep. Good morning. I slept cold last night. It only got down to minus 17 degrees Celsius. That was the overnight low. But I was quite cold. It was definitely not the most comfortable sleep that I've ever had. The quilt system worked really well. I was toasty warm with my top insulation, and I was able to toss and turn underneath the quilt without getting any of that down compression issue like I do with sleeping bags. So the quilt system passed the test, and I'll be trying to push the limits of the quilt into lower and lower temperatures. The next one will probably be minus 30, and then we'll see if I can get a quilt system down to minus 40. But the reason why I was feeling cold last night was the sleeping pad. I had really high hopes for the Ultra 7R. Like I mentioned, the 5R and 3R have been really great pads for me, but they use a different insulation type. They use synthetic insulation that's pulled between the top and bottom of the sleeping pad in order to create really good insulation. The Ultra 7R uses down insulation that's loose within each of the baffles, and I think maybe that's where I was encountering a problem. I did shake the sleeping pad before I went to bed and a couple more times over the course of the night in order to loosen up any down that might have been clumping and causing issues, but I was still very cold, and even when I went to bed and temperatures were only minus 10 degrees Celsius, I was still feeling a lot of heat loss through the sleeping pad. So the pad failed the warmth test, but it passed the comfort test. I was very comfortable on this pad, especially when I was sleeping on my side, way more comfortable than I would be on a Thermarest X-Therm or a Nemo Tensor extreme conditions. And that's promising. If I can get this pad to sleep warm by either replacing it or doing something with the down, I'll have to figure that out. Then I think it would be a very good winter pad. It wasn't super windy last night, so I wasn't able to fully test how the X-Dome deals with preventing heat loss due to wind, but I honestly don't think it's going to be as big of an issue as a lot of people think it might be. Sure, there might be a lot of mesh on the inner, especially on this door side, but there is a decent amount of solid material going up the sides of the tent, and if you pile snow around the outside, you can really prevent a lot of wind from coming inside the tent. The big thing I think that's going to be important when setting up the X-Dome in the wind is making sure that the side opposite the door is facing into the wind. You're going to get better structural stability that way, and you're not going to have as much wind kind of blowing into the tent. I think this is another good test of the X-Dome. It's slowly becoming my go-to tent in pretty much every kind of condition. I'm going to be bringing it out to the desert this January, so it'll be interesting to see how it does in kind of blowing sand. In windy and cold conditions where you don't have snow to pile up around the edges, or if you're in like the desert and you're dealing with a lot of blowing sand, you may want a little bit of a higher solid material on the inside here. And I think that is something that Dan could improve on, especially on the door. Maybe have the solid go up to about like 1/3 of the way up. I don't think you'd really impact ventilation much, and you'd get a little bit more of a solid tent. As I take the tent down, there's one other thing about the X-Dome that I think could use improvement, and again, it has to do with these feet here and how the poles go into them. The issue with these tent poles is that the little kind of knob at the end of the poles that inserts into those metal feet is not attached to the pole. So some other tent poles that I'm used to, these are actually screwed into the pole, and they don't come out like this. And what's annoying is that I'm used to those kind of poles, so when I'm trying to take a tent like this apart, I just kind of try and shake the pole in order to get the foot loose, but that doesn't happen, and what ends up happening is this little insert pops out, and it's actually kind of a pain in the butt to get back in. The reason they don't glue the inserts into the poles or anything like that is because you do want to be able to take the insert out if you want to repair the poles. So let's say a tent pole segment bends or breaks, you can take out the insert, undo the cordage that's holding the entire assembly together, and then replace an individual segment. I have mentioned this to Dan, and the reason he told me it's like this is because you can't get a carbon fiber pole system that has a better insert system. I think what I might do is either put some tape around that connection point in order to hold the insert onto the pole, or I might actually try to glue them in with a glue that if I heat it up with like a hairdryer or something like that, it softens up and I'm still able to pull the insert out. As far as the mesh base layer and how it's faring from a stink factor, not great, but I'm gonna pack up, hike out back to the car, and then I'll give you kind of the final verdict on how stinky it is. And I'll also let you know how the vapor barriers are doing from a durability standpoint. That wasn't a long hike out, wasn't a long hike in yesterday, so I wasn't really like getting a good sweat on or anything like that. But let's see how the mesh base layers are smelling. Not great, but not terrible, not as bad as I thought they would. I used to have polypropylene layers that I'd wear them for half a day and they would smell so bad that I'd have to wash them immediately. I don't know if the company makes this, treats it with some sort of anti-odor treatment, or if it's just because of the mesh, it has more surface area to kind of let odors dissipate and go, but pretty impressed. I probably wouldn't bring this if I was sharing a tent with like my wife for like 5 days. But if I'm going on a trip where I'm sleeping in a tent by myself and I don't really care how I smell, then I don't think it's gonna be an issue. Let's see how the vapor barriers are doing. On the hike out, I actually put the vapor barrier right against my skin and then put the sock on over top. I usually like that better because then I'm not getting any sweat into my sock. And they were a little damp this morning because of the fact that I put the vapor barrier on over top of them. And this is actually the hardest from a durability standpoint on the vapor barriers. The other plastic bags that I had, when I used them like this, they just ripped right away. But these are looking pretty good. Let's see if I take them off, if they get any rips or anything like that as they stick to my skin. No, not too bad. Even though they feel really thin, I think they're gonna be a lot more durable than some of the other things that I've tried to use for vapor barriers. So I'm excited to see if they can last an entire 4-day trip. I have another one of those trips with Marty and Kane again this winter, so I'll be using these and seeing how they do. Overall, I think that was a good series of tests. I'm really happy with what I learned about a lot of the gear I was testing. I'm a little disappointed in the Exped Ultra 7R sleeping pad. I wish I had slept warm because it was so comfortable to lay on. But I haven't given up on it. I'm gonna look into why it might have been sleeping cold for me. Maybe I have a defective pad and I need to get a new one. I'll look into it and hopefully can make the Exped 7R work, because I know it has worked for other people out there at very cold temperatures. So there might be something going on with the pad that I have. If you want to see that 4-day winter camping trip video that I did with Kane and Marty, go check it out right up there. It was an insanely fun but super challenging trip. We got over multiple mountain passes, temperatures down to below -3 degrees Celsius. It was pretty crazy. You know it's a high-end vehicle when it doesn't have a working trunk.